Good morning, everyone. Let's start with the GDP projections for the next year. So IMF predicts that the world GDP growth will slow down from 3.4% in 2022 to 2.8% in 2023. This year's economic slowdown is concentrating in advanced economies where growth is expected to fall to only 0.8%. By contrast, many emerging markets and developing economies are picking up, with year-to-year end growth accelerating to 4.5% in 2023 from 2.8% in 2022. Inflation remains stubbornly high at 6.8%. While global inflation has slowed down, that mostly reflects the reversal in energy and food prices. But core inflation, which excludes energy and food, keeps going up. World core inflation is expected to be at 5.1% in 2023, 0.6% increase from the last forecast. One of the biggest challenges to the world economy is actually coming from fighting the inflation, from the government money tightening. Following a prolonged period of low inflation and low interest rates, the financial sector has become too complacent. Now, the financial sector is facing huge challenges, and many banks have already fallen victims to the government's sharp money tightening. The risk for the world economy is that the banks, faced with the rising funding costs and the need to act more prudently, will cut down lending even further. Looking further ahead, the world growth is expected to remain at around 2.53% over the next 5 years. This forecast of 3% is the lowest growth projection since 90s and well below the average of 3.8 to 4% from the past 2 decades. This very weak GDP outlook reflects the tight government policy needed to bring down the inflation, the consequences of the Russia's war in Ukraine, and growing geoeconomic deglobalization. At the last conference, we were talking about the great volatility in the economy. Now we're entering the great reckoning phase, a tricky phase during which economic growth remains weak by historical standards, financial risks are higher than usual, and inflation has not yet been beaten, and the interest rates are rising. Looking at the GDP growth per country, looking at the different regions, this year economic slowdown is concentrated in advanced economies, especially the Euro area and the United Kingdom, where growth is expected to fall to 0.8%, and in the UK, minus 0.3%. So they're entering recession, before rebounding to 1.4 and 1% in 2024. European Union and UK continue to be affected the most from the war in Ukraine. By contrast, many emerging markets and developing economies are picking up with year-to-year end accelerating to 4.5%. Overall, Asia is expected to contribute astonishing 70% of global growth this year, a much greater share than in previous years. India is expected to grow very fast at 6.1% this year. Looking at the construction sector, so we managed to find this time some good information on what's going on. In the Eurozone, construction leading indicator shows weak sentiment, but previous pressures on the supply chain easing and the construction going ahead. We expect that the construction will be 3.9% up year on year in January. Buildings were up 4.2%, civil works up 3%. In the USA, tentative signs that the housing market supplies have been stabilizing. Building permits were up 15.8% in February. That's a very good sign. In China, we have some interesting information from China. Residential sector showing signs of stabilization. Infrastructure spending, start picking up. The decline in the new floor spaces started easing in February, and in April, a fantastic sign. It's a 4th month in a row when China property prices are going up. That's after 22 months of dropping. It's a very good news. Looking at the world steel production in 2022, So based on the World Steel Association numbers, in 2022, world steel production decreased by about 6%, approximately 120 million tons. The biggest production cuts have been implemented in the European Union, approximately 12%, and in African countries, approximately 12%. The only countries which increased production in 22 were Asian countries. From the main steel producing countries in the beginning of 2023, only China and India increased production by 6% and 3% respectively. Looking at the geographical distribution of steel production in 2022 in comparison to 10 years ago, China increased its share to 53% from 45%. India increased its share to 6.1% from 4.5%, and that's on account of all the other countries. Exports from China. Now, look, this is a very hot topic. Looking at the exports from China, the news that none of us would like to hear. In the first 3 months of this year, Chinese exports surged by 53% to 20 million tons year on year. That growth is accelerating. Month on month in March, exports grew by 55%. It's definitely something we should be really watching and worrying about. It's true that 95% of Chinese steel is sold at home, so export for Chinese mills is not important. But taking into account an oversized share that China has in the world production, even a small increase in export pushes world steel prices down. Looking at the long products consumption. So in 2022, consumption of steel long products decreased by 4%, approximately 37 million tons we've lost. It's slightly better than expected because at the last conference in Istanbul in 2022, we expected a 5.5% drop. If we look at the product consumption, product by product, basically we've lost consumption of every product. In sections, we lost about 10%, 5 million tons. In rebars, we've lost about 3.6%, 16 million tons in the world. And in wire rod, 7.3%, approximately 17 million tons. If we looked at the geographic concentration of rebar consumption, from the record 2021, in 2022, we saw a decrease of 16 million tons of 3.6%. Despite decrease in consumption in Asia, mainly in China, Asia still counts approximately 68% of the world rebar consumption. If we look at the last 10 years, how consumption has changed in the last 10 years, from 2012 to 2022, we can see the fastest growth in Asia, as always, 33%, in Eastern Europe and CIS by 25%, and Northern America at 17%. Europe was practically stagnant in the last 10 years. Now, moving on a more interesting topic, price movements since our last conference. So at the last conference, we pointed out that there is a two-tier supply system has formed in the international steel market. Sanctioned countries and long voyage origin material have to sell at lower prices to destinations that accept such material. Local mills and short voyage origin supply the rest of the demand. Since our last conference in Istanbul, this trend has only strengthened. Step by step, cheaper suppliers chipped at the market share of the local mills. Capacity utilization of rebar and wire rod mills in Europe and Turkey is going lower and lower. Until January, February 2023, Russia and Belarus were not that active in the international market because their domestic market was very strong and the local currency was strong. But starting from March 2023, they came to the export market again. In March 2023, Russia exported almost 200,000 tons of rebars and wire rods. This coincided with China abandoning their zero-COVID policy in February. Everyone was expecting a strong rebound in the Chinese consumption, similar to what happened in the rest of the world, but it never happened. Also in February, Turkey experienced a terrible earthquake with a lot of victims, and the government promised a quick rebuilding of the damaged cities that created, let's say, false hopes of extra demand, which again never seem to have come to the market. So also it seems that the steel mills in China and Asia increased production from March onwards, but the demand in China never materialized and rebuilding in Turkey never took place, so the prices started going down. We do not have yet Platts data for the 1st of May, but we all know where the market is today, and this graph has gone down a lot since then. So this is, again, this is information on the spread evolution. But again, I only have the data here until 5th of April. Since then, it's gone down a lot. So during 2022, steel mills managed to defend their spreads. High energy costs and raw material costs helped them to convince the customers to accept higher prices. This in turn caused surge in imports from sanctioned countries, Asia and Northern Africa. As a result, mills in Europe and Turkey had to reduce utilization, but the mills accepted it for some time. Low production volume and newly found price discipline helped the mills to maintain the margins, again, for some time. But all the good things have to finish. Mills increasingly find themselves under pressure from imports, but the high production costs are not there anymore. Contrary to what was expected, and thanks to the warm winter 2022-2023, energy costs have decreased substantially. As you can see on the slide, on the next slide, European gas prices have gone down to almost the historical level last seen before the war in Ukraine. Electricity prices in France, Germany, and Spain, they're still double of the pre-war level, but at least they're not 10 times higher what we saw in 2022. Scrap prices remained high for a long time, but in the last weeks, it seems to they have broken the $400 mark and they seem to be going down. So what we can say is that the spreads are still at the highest and historical levels, but the party has finished for sure for the mills. Everyone needs orders now, the gloves are off, and the battle for the market share begins. To sum up the outlook for long products, steel markets at the moment are hostages to the macroeconomics. Developed countries are carrying the majority of the economic burden caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Energy prices returning closer to the historical levels is probably a sign that the economies are not doing that well. Surging consumption after COVID did not last long, and the economic growth can only be described as anemic. Inflation is reducing demand for steel worldwide. Core inflation remains sticky and refuses to go down. Central banks increase the interest rate to fight the inflation, which caused many projects to be put on hold as developers not sure how to pass rising costs to the consumers. Despite record low unemployment in the developed countries, salaries are not increasing as much as the inflation. Moreover, it seems that we had entered into some form of slow motion financial crisis. Every week there are bad news about another bank going under in the USA and Europe. China has a lot of problems of their own. But despite the fact that China is going through the financial crisis, there are some very, very good news coming out of China recently. So this is Chinese PMI, steel PMI, and new order intake. So the PMI was at 45% in April, and the new order index was at 39%, which is very, very bad. But that seems to be the case of the Chinese mill increasing production too quickly after they stopped zero COVID policy. It will be very interesting to hear presentation today from the Chinese steel industry. The good news is Chinese railway investment have gone up 6.6% in Q1 of this year, and infrastructure investment have gone up 15% in the beginning of the year. In April, Chinese home prices increased fourth time in a row after 22 months of reductions, according to the official data. Cement production in China increased 15% in Q1 of this year. These investments seem to be going through the system, and we hope or we expect to have Chinese demand for steel to pick up strongly in Q3 of this year. So to sum up, demand for steel this year seem to be much weaker than the supply, but there are signs that the tide is turning. In the words of the famous economist Nassim Nicholas Taleb, 5% interest rate melts fake assets like butter. Banks and financial companies were first in line of fire, but at some point, all the companies will be tested. But there are many reasons to be optimistic. There is a lot of money in the world which is looking for good investment opportunities. Banks don't pay good interest rate on the deposits, and the bank deposits are quite risky these days. You know how much the hotel rooms cost now. You know how much flights cost. People are ready to spend and they're ready to invest, but first they're looking for good opportunities. Once the financial crisis will clean up the banking system and then the industries, there will be a flood of investments. There are shortage of housing everywhere. The infrastructure in Europe and the USA have to be renovated. Turkey needs to be rebuilt. We often hear that 5% interest rate is killing the projects. But please bear in mind that at the historical level, 5% interest rates are actually quite reasonable. We had 5% rate in 2003, and the businesses worked perfectly then. Also, please consider two pieces of good news from last week. Unemployment in the USA is at the lowest point since 1969. And in the USA, monthly construction survey showed that the sales will rise 7% in 23 of the new homes. In November 22, the same survey was expecting a drop of -9%. Of course, it will take some time for business to adjust to new interest levels. They will have to cut the cost, restructure. Of course, some will not make it. But wait till Q3, things will be much better then. The famous investor Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway said about the crisis like this: you only find out who is swimming naked when the tide goes out. Thank you for your attention.
Motivation to start. Are there any questions for Mr. Gordienko from the floor? Can I see? No questions at this time. So thank you very much for all this motivation and optimism.